Mr. Gordon, thanks again for coming in. I want you to start by telling me what independence means to you.
Well, that's a long time ago, but my recollection is that at the moment that it happened, there were so many conflicting things that were happening around me. To capture the sense of the moment, though, I suppose I'd say that I realized we were moving from a state of dependency on others to becoming responsible for ourselves as a sovereign country. We would now be making the decisions that mattered. Now, until you live that kind of reality, it's one thing to talk about it, but you don't really fully grasp the significance of it at the moment. I just know that I just recall it being a very emotional time for me and thinking that I was moving to a different level. What I would encounter, I wasn't too sure, but I felt it was a good thing to do and I was very proud of it.
Okay, so you didn't have any misgivings at all?
No, I had none whatever. I remember some people expressing great concern that now we're moving, things are going to break down, discipline is going to disappear, what is going to happen, white people in the country going to be run out. Well, all these were fears. And you also complicated all that by a real shade distinction which you had at that time. We were our own worst enemies in many ways, and one could tell many stories about that. But the shade distinctions we had in the country weren't good. And they created problems even amongst the homogeneous, the black person in the country. If you were a little fairer than the other person, there are certain things you could do. And this is where Geddes Granger and Black Power played a significant role in transforming many of those things. So that there were many things when you throw your mind back that you have to say some of those fears were justified as fears for people who didn't want to run the risk of changing the comfort of their lives. But they were justified. But the reality is that countries can't stand still. They have to move forward. And you only move forward by taking responsibility for yourself, learning from what you do, and developing. And I think that's what we're in the process of doing.
You think that we were ready for independence when we got it in 1962?
I don't know that anybody can ever be ready, like you get ready for a race and say, start, ready, go. You're never really ready for something like that until you have lived it. But I think it came at a good time. I think we were fortunate, and I never thought I'd live to hear myself say this, because I was always a critic of Dr. Williams's. But I think we were very fortunate to have had him as the man who led us into independence, because his balance and his maturity and his capacity as a communicator, and in essence he had an inherent sense of fairness, which didn't always come out, because sometimes he had a very sharp tongue, and if he was on you, he was on your case very seriously. But I think in balance, we were very fortunate to have had him take us into independence.
Okay, tell me a bit more about your thoughts on his contribution to the independence movement.
It was tremendous. In fact, I brought my book here because I captured a sense of what I thought of him at that time in the book. And it said, his leadership into independence was inspired, for he understood the complicated psyche of the Trinidadian and forged his powerful base of support through a combination of intellectual dialogue and practical socialism, because he was that, a practical socialist. Not for him the loud-mouthed denunciations of the moneyed classes and better-off sections of the population, which were so popular with the radicals of the day, except when he became blasted vexed. He went about his business of building his political base, aggressively dismantling the relics of colonialism, and building around his persona a mystique of inaccessibility. That was the man. He removed himself. He always kept you at a distance, except for those he wanted to embrace for whatever reason. And that had some merit to him at the time. But he was an extraordinary leader, not a good manager, a very bad manager, but he was an extraordinary leader who had the strength of his convictions He had the powerful base of academia behind him. And he had courage. And he demonstrated this, even though some people thought he was physically a coward. I think he demonstrated this during the riots we had and other things like that, when people around him were beginning to crack. And he demonstrated great calm, and that's when it really mattered.
Okay, you said he wasn't a very good manager. Care to elaborate on that a bit?
A manager is someone who understands how to work through others and get them to achieve results. That's what the good manager does. He inspires the people around him to achieve their potential. And that's how he gets things done, because no one man can do it all. Dr. Williams, I don't think, ever understood that. I mean, he was so busy in his academic world that things like management of people clearly were not any part of his concern. In fact, I know of one instance, and this is true, where he stopped speaking to his secretary for 6 months, his personal secretary. That gives you an idea of how extraordinary he was. But that said, he was not given to he was given to leading a team and dictating what should happen. He would expect, I think, all the proper things to do and go through the democratic process, and at the end of the day, be seen to be consulting. But at the end of the day, his comfort was with what Dr. Williams wanted. And you can't really lead and get the best managerial results from dominating people. You have to get people to rise. You have to develop people. And I don't think that was ever a part of his makeup. I think instinctively, some people who worked under him patterned themselves after him. I mean, you would know, for instance, just to take a look at some of the leaders we've had since him. We've had Mr. Chambers, you've had Mr. Robbins, you've had a non-prime minister, but Carl Hudson Phillips. They were all leaders of the PNM. You have there was a style of all those people, which was clearly a stamp that came from the Williams style of operating, largely because there was this instinctive admiration of certain qualities of the man, which, I repeat, he was probably, and this is arguable, I suppose, but in my book, he was the best leader the Caribbean has ever produced.
Okay. Are you satisfied with the growth of Trinidad and Tobago since we got our independence in 1962?
No, I'm not. I'm not. I can't say that I'm satisfied with it, because I should admit, first of all, that I'm seldom satisfied. But I do think we have made good progress. I think we have handled some of our blessings very well. Energy, for instance, extremely well. I don't think we've handled agriculture very well. And I think that was largely because of all the complications tied up with Indo and Afro and all the politics that attended that. But to be fair, it was more than that, because you also had the complication of the economy becoming relatively wealthy in terms of the energy sector and the wages that it was driving, that they were driving in that sector. And it was very difficult to strike a balance. On the other hand, if people are living in the same country and one is getting this wage and the other one is this way, that's a recipe for confusion, because there's always difficulty, particularly when the one that is earning so much less has no hope to see that being corrected. So that we have had that endemic problem. But I think if one had to give a mark, marking from 1 to 10, 10 being the top mark, I think we could probably rate a 7.5. I don't think we've done badly. Okay. I think we have fallen down is we have fallen down in terms of permitting too much of the give me symptom to dominate the society. Now, again, to be fair, if one traces back to Dr. Williams, we would have to admit that it started with him. It started with him when he realized he had to get money into the hands of people one way or the other. And there was this, I forgot what it was called at the time, the first giveaway work program, whatever it was called. It was the first program in which people were supposed to get a fee for working, and they didn't work.
Okay.
It was the norm. Now, it was understandable to start the ball rolling because you had to do something. But instead of maturing that program and relating it to productivity, instead of, as the society developed, taking the society and saying, okay, we're going to make it now that instead of you come to work and you sign on at 6 o'clock and you're gone by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and meanwhile you sit down and you do nothing and you still get a bigger wage than you would have been getting otherwise, or other people are getting, and creating a problem by that, instead of addressing that by saying, okay, from here on, you see these 3 blocks here and these 3 blocks here, you're responsible for these 3 blocks. You get paid when these 3 blocks are cleaned. Now, we could have taken that course, but I don't think the people who were leading us at the time understood the absolute imperative of making people productive and thinking productively. The result, we're paying the price for it now, is that we developed more and more a gimme system, and in fact it has been the boast of one political party at one stage, and I notice happily that they've stopped boasting about that, is we take care of you from birth to grave. From the time you're born to the time you're dead, we take care of you. Now, that's the kind of thing that has put us in so much trouble today. But I'm an optimist, and I see the sign of a society that is producing very effectively. And I'm optimistic, very frankly, very optimistic about the future of our country. But we've had our problems in arriving here.
Okay. So let's go back a bit. It's August 30th, 1962.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a bit about what you remember, the sights and sounds, the atmosphere.
Well, remember that I was at that time in radio.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we'd started television yet. No. Or had we? No, we had not started with television. Television started in 62. My recollection of that evening was that I had a broadcast team, and Peter Minshall a few years ago triggered my recall of this story that I'm about to tell you. I was heading the broadcast team, and it was assumed, of course, that I would do the big thing at midnight was the flags were lowered and capture that moment. And I was saying to myself, well, you know, I've got to get ready for this. But then there was something that kept saying to me, but you know, this moment should belong to Peter Minshall, because even though he was a part of my team, he always had such a touch of drama in him that I felt the dramatic moment of lowering of that flag was something that we should use our very best talent for. But I suppose my ego kept me from conveying that decision to him at the moment, and it struck because I was struggling internally with it. And then about 5 or 10 minutes before I turned to him, I said, Peter, this is your moment, you have to do it. No, I had forgotten completely about that until Peter reminded me about this some years ago. He says, I'll never forget that moment. And it was absolute truth. And he did a supreme job with it. Because you needed drama. I tend to be a little too calm, I suppose. But Peter was very dramatic as the flags changed. And he was one of the very extraordinary talents we had right at the beginning of television. Because television also started in 1962, you know that.
Mm-hmm. But do you regret giving up that moment at all?
No, of course not. No. My good fortune in life is I have few regrets. If I do something and I've considered it and I think it's the right thing to do, I take my consequences. But he was the right person to do it.
Okay, so the Union Jack is lowered and our flag is hoisted up. How did you feel in that moment?
Well, there was so much emotion floating around. It's difficult to determine who was more emotional than whom. What I do know is that we all swallowed a little. We all felt that this was we didn't quite understand why, I suppose, at least some of us. But we all understood this was a big moment in our lives. And from here on, we had to take responsibility for ourselves. We knew all the things about it. But it's one thing to know what you're saying. It's another thing to know, to live it. And the living it has been the more difficult part. But at the moment, I think everybody was, because you remember you also had the march for Shagaramas for something else. But you had all these things that happened, and Dr. Williams's perhaps big moment, in my view, was an address that he gave it was addressed to the nation. And again, I like to quote this, if I may, from my book, because it is something that I'll tell you a story about. Part of his address was, there can be no Mother India for those whose ancestors come from India. There can be no Mother Africa for those of African origin. There can be no Mother China, even if one could agree as to which China is the mother. And there can be no Mother Syria and no Mother Lebanon. A nation, like an individual, can have only one mother. The only mother we recognize is Mother Trinidad and Tobago. And the mother cannot discriminate between her children. Now, I think those were tremendous words. But you could put them together and put it over so effectively was a moment that should not have just been captured that evening, but should have been perpetuated in the lives, throughout the lives of our young people coming up. And one of the things that followed that, quite a few years later, was that I lived with such a strong recollection of this that I contacted William Dimas, who was Dr. Williams's main advisor, economic advisor, and indicated we wanted to take that message, put it in a frame, and put it in every school in the country, so that every morning children would come in and there, before them would be those words, which over time would hopefully impact on how they lived and related to each other. And Dr. Williams agreed to do so, even though he was not a man given to that kind of thing too much. He was not a PR type person at all. But he understood the significance of it. And it was agreed that this Saturday morning we would go to his office and present it to him. And that would launch the campaign thereafter, We the Express, because we were struggling at the time and I don't think we could even pay our bills. But we undertook that we were going to put that up in every school in the country. And there we were getting ready for, and about a week before, drama took over. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau of Canada was arriving in Trinidad. And he arrived in Trinidad, and Dr. Williams sent a very junior person from the Foreign Office to meet Mr. Trudeau. And this caused one big hullabaloo, and the Express had a front page editorial saying not very nice things about Dr. Williams for having done so, indicating that that kind of behavior is just not on, and so on and so on. We went to town. Well, he also went to town. First of all, he cancelled the presentation, which was to be done on the Saturday. And then about 3 weeks later, he decided he would make a speech and respond to the Express editorial chapter by chapter, which he did. And systematically, every one of we called him boorish, and he dealt with why it was in boorish behavior and so on. And then when he got toward the end, he said, and I want the Express to know that so many years ago, I don't remember, it was 2 or 3 years ago, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago went to Canada, and he had to take a taxi to get it to get into the capital. So that it is nothing unusual for Mr. Trudeau not to be met by any senior person when he comes here. And that was, I mean, Dr. Williams, that was a man. But there was also another an addendum to that. He says, and I also want the Express to know that the application for a television license has been rejected out of hand. Now, in today's world, no prime minister in this country could be so blatant and so indifferent to public opinion as to give us his reason, pique, for turning down a license, because I think our democracy, fortunately, has developed beyond that. But at that time, that spoke volumes of the absolute confidence Dr. Williams had in himself, and the support base that he had, and so on and so on. So that that was the man. That's a long way of answering your simple question, how I felt on that night. But one thing led to the other.
Anything else stood out about that experience to you in the lead up to when our flags were raised?
The other truth, of course, is that, remember, I was heading a broadcast team that night. That broadcast, whatever was taking place, we were trying to capture. And when you're so busy, when you're so involved in producing something, you don't have too much time to reflect on the emotional implications of that moment. So that if I try to give you a thoughtful answer now, it would be something that I'd be making up, because it's nothing that I recall. That's the truth.
Okay. But once the dust had settled and while the broadcast was over, it was official. Trinidad and Tobago was an independent nation. What were your thoughts? What did you feel?
Well, I mean, first of all, one had to come to terms with the reality on a step-by-step basis. And we had a reality in this country that we need to be aware of, and I'm not too sure how many people are aware of it. Let me tell you a small experience which begins to put it in shape. When I decided to apply for the job of announcer at Radio Trinidad, there was no person of color who was an announcer. There was a man called Sam Gani, who was an excellent broadcaster, who was there before me. He was a very fair-skinned Indian person and tremendous personality, but he was sales manager. He was not an announcer as such. He did do the odd bits and pieces from time to time. And when I applied and I walked into that station, people couldn't believe that I was saying that I'd come for an interview, because there was nobody like me around at that stage. Bottom line is, I had the interview, I had the test, I was called in right away, and I was told, we are going to give you an opportunity. We're going to give you a month to learn to say R. First of all, I couldn't say R. I used to say ow, ow, ow. I couldn't get my mouth around it. If you learn to say R, you can get the job at the end of a month. But meanwhile, you can come here. I said, I'm happy to come. No salary, but I just want to be around and learn everything for a month. I did that. Meanwhile, I took elocution lessons from a goodly lady called Mrs. Carmen Akam Chen. No, I'm unfair to them, because they did pay me $30 for the month. I now remember that, because I had to pay the full $30 to Mrs. Chen. Bottom line is, I learned to say R, and I learned to say R by a small combination of words. Round and round the rugged rocks, the ragged rascal ran. And I used to say that 1,000,000 times every day. Round and round the rugged rocks, the ragged rascal ran. So I learned to say R, and I got the job. The point I'm making is, the night that I had that interview, I received a telephone call from a lady called Hill. What was her first name? She was Cecil Errol Hill's sister. And she happened to be the secretary of the manager, of the managing director of the radio, of the television station. And she said, come across to my home. I live in Edward Street. I was living in St. Vincent Street. And I went across to her home, and she said, I want to show you something. I work there and I have enjoy my job. You're coming to make a career here, but I wanted to see what you could encounter. And she pulled out of her desk an ad that had appeared in the newspaper 10 years before that night, which said, announcer needed, only white need apply. Now that was in Trinidad. And that would have had to be, because that event occurred in 49, so that would have had to be sometime around 39, 40, when that ad appeared. In fact, that ad subsequently, I understand, led to their appointing Hugh Wooding as chairman. That changed the color of things, and a lot of things happened. People sent back rediffusion boxes. There was a lot of drama. But that was the climate that existed. Another story that is very relevant around that time, the shade distinctions that we had in the country were very sharp. So that even amongst dark people, black people, we had this one could pass or that one could pass, and that led to who went into what society and what. This sounds terrible to repeat, but those were the facts. I went one night to a certain club, and I will not call its name, to a party. And we were going up the steps, and a brother and a sister were ahead of me, and I was behind them with a few other people. And the sister was able to go in, and the brother couldn't go in. And she went in, and he stayed outside. No, that's what, those were the things that were accepted as a norm. Nobody really too much of a fuss, because remember, you didn't have anything like the vibrant media that you have now. Things like this were never broadcast, were never covered. Even if people knew about it, they accepted that that was the way of life, and nobody worried too much, apart from the few intellectual people who would brood about it. So in that kind of environment, you had a lot of things that needed correcting, and a lot of things had to be addressed, and politically they had to be very careful about how they went about it. And Dr. Williams, I think, handled it pretty well in balance. He made a few unfortunate remarks at times, but in balance, I think he handled it pretty well.
Okay. Care to compare for me life before and after independence? What was life like before as compared to life before?
Before independence, it was, I think I've outlined to you what I think was the environment.
Good.
But it was a disciplined environment. It was an environment in which, well, of course, we wouldn't even talk about crime, because while you obviously had instances of crime, you didn't have anything like what we have today. It's a different ball game altogether. But the foreigners had laid down a pretty solid system. I think the civil service was a lot more effective than it is today, and largely because as we developed as a society, more and more politics began to impact on some of the decisions, on some of the appointments. These caused great problems. Many of them were not handled well. When I spoke favorably a moment ago about giving us 7.5, I couldn't go into all the details, but there were many, many instances of things that should never have happened. Politics were being played. But again, that is an inevitability of a society that moves from colonialism to a developed and sophisticated society. But in overall terms, I think we have fallen very far short of the standards that we met. Vulgarity today has run away with us. But again, I suppose that's perhaps a worldwide phenomenon. I would make a comment about that, though, is I think we're going too far now. I think some of the things that are happening at times like Carnival are disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. And I think so many people seem to forget that Ash Wednesday is a day they also have to revert to living. And I would really hope that the depth to which some of the exposure and indecency occurs, that people will put a brake on it. Because inherently I think we're good and decent people, but we just get carried away with some excesses, and that is one of the things I have a bit of a bug in my mind about. Crime, of course, is an international phenomenon, and it's not related to us only, and we have the complication being next to Venezuela and being next to South America and having ready access, and the guns are coming in, and I don't know that we're going about it the right way. I think instead of trying to make it difficult for people to get into the country, which is something that I think a former administration had attempted to do, and control the intake of guns, we didn't do that. And I mean, I remember distinctly some years ago when I was the chairman of a crime committee. We were told by police officers who appeared before us that at that time they knew where the guns were. Because this was fairly early in terms of the problem. And one went so far as to say he could carry us and show us where the guns were, because they knew where the guns were. Our committee encouraged, at the time, Mr. Manning was the Prime Minister, encouraged Mr. Manning at the time to declare a state of limited emergency to try and give the powers to the police to go after where they knew the guns were. Advanced all the arguments for it. He was loath to do it, of course, because that's so politically charged that it can always blow up in your face, as we've subsequently seen happen. But the reality is that was an opportunity, if what was told to us was factual, when if we had gone after it, we could have broken the back of the guns that had started to come into this country, and we didn't. Since then, it's become very difficult to achieve that. And it's only a long, hard slog that's going to do it. I don't think it's something that anybody can be expected to solve overnight. It's got to be systematically dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with from both points of view. You have to deal with those people who you can't hope to change, and you have to deal firmly with them. And then you've got to put programs in place that would try and avoid the dropouts that have been occurring, which have led to so much disillusionment, and people go off and become very readily available for doing other people's dirty work. So that, anyway, I've moved along a little beyond your question.
As we prepare to wrap up, do you think that younger generations really understand what went into us earning or fighting for getting our independence? Do you think that we appreciate it enough?
No. We don't appreciate, and this is one of the flaws in our society. We don't appreciate what really happened, and you can't blame the younger person. You have to blame those who went before, who didn't make it a point and are not making it a point to try and keep the story of our past before the younger people. First of all, younger people are not reading as much because they're so tied up in technology that they really don't have too much time to get into books. Not all of them, of course, but a few, and this is unfortunate. But it's just unfortunate that there's been no concerted effort. And if I had to point a finger, I suppose I would point it at the direction of the university to have been producing material which would keep people informed of the past, of what has happened in the past. So many people, I once had an experience where I went to a function. It wasn't very long ago. I had not retired as yet, so that gives you an idea of timing. I called some names of people who had played such outstanding roles. I called the name of Ken Julian, and I called the name of Sidney Knox, and I called the name of Tommy Gatliff and Frank Rampersad, and a host of people. And these were young men who were in the business community. They didn't know who were these people. And quite frankly, that's one of the reasons that led me to write my book eventually. Because I was so stunned that day that here were people who, as I grew up, were making such a tremendous contribution to take this country forward. And here was just, not even, it was, 10 years hadn't gone by. And there was a new crop of people, business community people, who did not know even the names of these people. And that told me something that was very significant, and I think it's a great pity. But it's not too late, and I hope we will do something about it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming in, Mr. Gordon, and thanks so much for answering my questions.
It's been a pleasure, young lady. Thank you very much.